introduction. First of all, many thanks to Aneta and Lawrence for organizing this interesting conference and for giving me the opportunity to present this research project that we developed in the National Museum of Fine Arts in Santiago. Today I will summarize the current results of this project concerning the reconstruction of the history of the so-called Museo de Copias, that is the Museum of Copies. In the first part of the presentation, I will recall the origin and the context of its creation. The second part of the lecture focuses on the history of the collection from its beginning around 1900 to the regular decomposition and degradation during the 20th century. Finally, in the conclusion, I will present the activities of the museum, and particularly of its collections department, in the process of re-evaluation and the attempt to restore the significance of this collection within the history of our museum. This story begins in 1869, when the Chilean writer and academician Daniel Barros-Grez proposed the creation of a collection of models, copies of European great artworks. I quote, "Let's start with a collection of good copies in order to obtain good original works by Chilean artists. When speaking about those models, anything has more value than nothing, especially when that something could be a good collection of reproductions of classical artworks, and when with that something, Chile could achieve the understanding of the love for art, creation of good taste, education of artists, and eventually obtain masterworks." It was not until the turn of the 20th century when the idea of a museum of copies did come true, thanks to the actions and engagement of Alberta Maquena Subercason. Coming from a powerful clan of French origin, a privileged family full of politicians, high officials, and people concerned with the development of their country, Maquena already at a very young age visited Europe, where he observed and understood well the educational systems of art academies in France, England, Italy, and Germany. In 1899, 24-year-old Alberto presented the Chilean intellectual elite and political authorities with a similar idea of a museum of copies, and managed to convince the government to dedicate a large sum of money, that was around 30,000 francs at this moment, for buying the reproductions in museums of Europe. Consequently, Maquena went to Italy and France, where in 1901 he acquired the copies. It is crucial here to understand the context of that commission. The Academy and the Museum of Fine Arts were established in Santiago in 1849 and 1880, respectively. However, already at the end of the 19th century, it was clear that those two core institutions of the national artistic education system required complex reforms and an organized state support policy if expected to bear fruit in the form of great artists and admirable national art. Both of them were housed in small, inadequate buildings and poorly situated areas of the developing city, which resulted in lack of visiting public, lack of enrolled students, and finally, lack of prestige those type of institutions should possess. So this is the old building of the school, or the Academy of Fine Arts, and this is the small temporary building of the Museum of Fine Arts in Santiago. Moreover, although the ideal of academic education and classical art dominating in Chile until the first quarter of the 20th century, they were following the French academic tradition, neither the students nor the public had access to models required for the development of that type of art production, while costly trips to Europe did not fit in the budget of the majority of the future artists. Finally, it was believed that the lack of strength of the academic education in Chile had a consequence in the general bad taste of the society. It was then in the end of the 19th century when complex programs of Chilean arts revival emerged. One of them, published in 1892, by Alberto Maquena's older cousin, a painter and diplomat, Ramón Subercaseaux Vicuña. The proposal of Subercaseaux included, among others, a reform of the Academy of Fine Arts, a more artistic scholarship for sending students to Europe, a modernization of the National Museum, as well as creation of a museum and an Academy of Applied Arts. In his publication, he mentioned the Museum of South Kensington, the Victoria and Albert Museum today, and the Museum of Comparative Sculpture in Paris, as the ideal models, especially worth following, and he evoked particularly their extensive use of plaster cast copies. In this context, the collection of reproductions in the National Museum of Fine Arts in Santiago, the so-called Museo de Copias, that arrived from Europe, from European workshops with Maquena around 1902, has to be seen as an element of the comprehensive program of improvement and development of the situation of the period's national Chilean art. Maquena's lobbying eventually resulted also in the construction in 1910 of the Palace of Fine Arts that housed both the museum and the academy. And here I show, this is the facade of the museum. This is the plan. This is the facade that we saw. This is the part that is occupied until today by the museum. This is the part that housed before the academy. Both of them are communicated by two passages and they share an auditorium. So apart from the building, Maquena's lobbying resulted also in a large international exhibition for the 100th anniversary of Chilean independence and eventually the opening of the Museo de Copias in August 1911. The goals of Maquena's activities and enterprises can be derived from the analysis of his text compilation published in 1915 with the meaningful title Luchas por el Arte, which can be translated as Fights for Art. In general, Maquena expected the Museo de Copias to result in the artistic progress of the country achieved through the education of the artists, formation of good artistic taste in the society, and teaching about the history of the most developed countries treated as models to follow. Maquena and his contemporaries believed in the idealistic concept in which art is able to change the man and his society, while the artistic development is followed by the development of culture and civilization. We encounter that attitude in one of texts where Maquena promises that, I quote, "When there is among us more elevation of the ideals, when there is growth of art in all of its manifestations, and there is the understanding of its influence and its purpose in the lives of the people, our civilization will be more perfect and we will be more cultured and happier." As we can see, the collection of the Museo de Copias being an ersatz of the European museums and a representation of European art development had an extremely important role in the complex program of reforms of Chilean art and education in the beginning of the 20th century. The collection itself was diverse in styles, techniques, and artistic categories, and was composed of at least 445 pieces, according to the shipping report found in the archives in Santiago. Nevertheless, nowadays, only less than 10%, around 10% of those works remain in the museum. The rest, dispersed among other institutions, destroyed during earthquake or due to negligence, stolen or otherwise lost during the past century. Unfortunately, the exact identification of the copies is not possible, since up to date no official list of the brought pieces has been found, in spite of a thorough investigation. It was, however, possible to partly reconstruct the collection based on the old inventory books and contemporary catalogues of the museum, some historic photographs, and the available archives. The majority of the collection was executed in plaster and brought from Parisian plaster cast workshops, most probably from the Atelier de Moulage du Louvre, or the workshop of the École des Beaux-Arts. A large part of the works are made of terracotta and were bought at the Manifattura di Signa, close to Florence. And finally, also some marble and bronze copies probably should be included into the group of works brought by McKenna from Paris or Rome. When the collection was opened to the public for the first time in 1911, its large section was presented in the museum, that's principally in the main hall, with some smaller pieces distributed also in the galleries. Here we can see this figure of a dancing satyr that I showed before, presented in one of the galleries. While another group of the copies adorned the Academy of Fine Arts in the same building. I remind you that it's just the other part of the same building. Contrary to most contemporary collections of copies, the Museo de Copias in Santiago included not only reproductions of antique sculpture, which of course did constitute a large portion of the whole collection, but also masterworks of Renaissance artists, of Baroque period, as well as the artists of the 18th and 19th century. And here, except from a copy of Antonio Canova's boxer that I showed before, there were many French 18th and 19th century artists. Those are copies that were sent to different institutions. Nowadays, this Eve is housed in the building of the Faculty of Medicine of the University of Chile. That piece was transferred now permanently to one of the provincial museums. Here we can reconstruct part of this collection also from the old catalogs of the museum. So here are some other pieces, copies of works of French artists that nowadays don't exist anymore. We cannot find them even in any other institutions, but I just show them as a reference of what type of works there were in the collection. In fact, especially France and French art seem to have been the main source of inspiration for Alberto Mackenna. As mentioned, the plaster cast copies came from French workshops, while among the reproductions of the 18th and 19th century, works by French artists prevailed. Moreover, the building of the Palace of Fine Arts was designed by a Chilean architect of French origin and a student in the French capital, Emilio Jacquin, while his project is believed to be inspired by the recently opened Petit Palais in Paris. And finally, even the distribution of the works in the main hall of the museum recalls the exposition of the plaster casts in the Parisian École des Beaux-Arts from that period. Among the copies brought from Europe, there are also many models of classical architecture motifs, such as friezes, capitals, ornamental details. Those pieces, brought with the intention of serving in the process of education of craftsmen, were on view in the rooms of the Academy of Fine Arts, together with a large portion of the ancient sculpture reproductions. While the exposition in the Academy was focused on providing models for copying, corresponding to the traditional system of academic education in which the students were supposed to learn from drawing ancient figures and ornaments, the sculptures in the main hall of the museum were intended to fulfill the other postulate of Mackenna's reform, and that is the formation of good taste in the society. The museum, unlike the Academy, was open for general public and presented copies of famous ancient figures mixed up together with reproductions of modern artworks and original sculptures of Chilean and foreign artists. Unlike in the aforementioned examples of the Museum of Comparative Sculpture in Paris or the South Kensington Museum, the exposition in Santiago did not maintain the chronological order associated with education of historical epochs and art development. Instead, all the pieces were located in a symmetrical layout, the center of which was occupied by a large original sculpture of Descent of Christ by the Chilean Virginia Arias, and other important original works distributed symmetrically, marking four corners of the virtual square around the central figure. So I hope it's visible. This is the Descent of Christ by Virginia Arias. Here there are four pieces that are around it. All of those are original works. The remaining sculptures were placed along the walls with larger figures accentuating the corners and the axis of the hall, and in two rows across the width of the space. The reliefs hang on the walls, while smaller objects, such as vases and ornaments, rested in the glass cabinet on the second floor. It's just not visible here, but it is here. Such aesthetic, rather than chronological distribution of the sculptures, complies with the objectives of the reform program. Beautiful examples from different epochs did not serve for representation of the art history development, but rather were a substitute of the marvels of the European museums that could conceive good taste in the Chilean nation. Additionally, this character of the collection was emphasized by the arrangement of the hall in the form of a garden of sculpture, with plants with grass and benches to rest on, a space of reflection, study, and aesthetic contemplation. Although its importance in the beginning of the century, the general decrease in the significance and admiration of plaster casts and broadly copies that progressed in Europe did affect the Museo de Copias when a similar process occurred in Chile. While still in 1929, the reformulated status of the National Museum in Santiago declared that the mission of the institution was to collect pieces of fine and applied arts, of national and foreign artists, and original works and reproductions. In the decade of the 1930s, we can already spot the first severe cracks on that marvelous image of the copies. During that period, many works from both the museum and the academy were sent to provincial museums. Apart from the general drop in esteem for the classical sculpture reproductions, this situation can be explained by the changes in the Chilean art scene. In fact, the copies were perceived to have had already accomplished their purpose in the capital. During the 2 decades when the Museo de Copias was available for the public, the Santiaguinos have already grown to know it, and by 1930 also to outgrow it. Moreover, the end of the decade of the 1920s is the time of the military dictatorship of Carlos Ibáñez in Chile and the reform of the artistic educational system. During that time, the official support shifted from the ideals of fine art to social usefulness of the applied arts that would facilitate the modernization, industrialization, and development of the country, as well as would put art and artists closer to the people. In the museum, the transformations and modernization of that period started with a general reconstruction of the building. In 1933, the refurbishment included, among others, the removal of the excess of the stucco ornamentation in the building, a change of the wall color to a lighter, more neutral tone, and the replacement of the solid ground of the hall with cement tiles. The works resulted also in modifications to the exposition. And in the hall, it meant that the changes of the pedestals, removal of most of the plants, as well as the reliefs from the walls, and narrowing of the number of works exhibited. Interestingly, Alberto Mackenna reappears in that story, this time as the director of the museum, the position that he assumed in the same year, 1933. In the annual report of the museum's activities, he described the new selection in the hall, stating that the preference was given to sculptures in marble, bronze, terracotta, and finally also the best examples among the plaster casts. In practice, it meant that most of the smaller and less popular reproductions were stored away. Eventually, the majority of those those removed works, described in the archives as of too little value to be exhibited in the National Museum, they were sent to regional museums. And here I show a picture from a museum in southern Chile, in a city called Talca. In the 1930s, many pieces, around 29 pieces, were sent to a museum in a coastal city of Valparaiso, and around 60 pieces to that museum in Talca. Sending the copies on long-term loans or transferring them to regional institutions was considered part of the artistic propaganda led by the authorities of the museum. Additionally, for the purposes of spreading the classical ideals of art in the provinces, in the decade of the 1930s, the museum regularly executed plaster or white cement reproductions for sale. Apart from the original masterworks of Chilean artists, the pieces reproduced most often included such works as the Discobolas, or also modern works like the Jeanne d'Arc by Henri Chaput, or the previously shown Antonio Canova's boxers. Here I show those are white cement copies that were placed in the campus of the university in another southern Chilean city, Concepcion. Indeed, in 1939, the museum established even an official plaster cast workshop in which the molds were made, and the institution continued distributing reproductions of famous European and local sculptures till the end of the 1960s. Although this educational role of the copies was important as a part of the artistic propaganda during that period, the museum constantly struggled with the lack of financial resources for maintenance and conservation of the Museo de Copias. The archives preserve a countless number of regrets that the institution cannot afford restoration of the deteriorated plaster casts, and requests for funds to renovate the leaking iron and glass dome, dripping water on the figures. The then director Alberto Mackenna admitted additionally the existence of another problem related to the conservation of the reproductions. That is, that Chile simply lacked in professional restorers with sufficient capacities and experience to manage those fragile pieces. The poor storage conditions and inability to restore the works led in 1934 to removing from the museum collection all the plaster casts that were broken or in bad state of conservation. In parallel, the number of complaints about the leaking dome and thus the danger for the reproductions decreased in the following decades, concurring with the diminishing appreciation of and care for the classical models. The last registered conservation of one of the works from the Museo de Copias comes from 1952 and refers to the maintenance of this reproduction of the famous Diana of Versailles. Rather forgotten and neglected by now, the sculpture collection of the museum remained almost untouched in the main hall until the end of the 60s. Indeed, if we were to point out the most disastrous date for the Museo de Copias collection, it would have to be the year 1969. In July of that year, that's how it looked at the moment, the hall, the main hall with the exposition. In July of that 1969, the third floor of the Academy of Fine Arts caught on fire, and consequently, the school abandoned the building and moved to another setting. Only 5 years later, did a different institution, the Museum of Contemporary Art, occupy the renovated rooms of the Fine Arts Palace. Those are photos of just after the fire. As we can see, the copies are still there. It's not really clear in what state. But surprisingly, until today, it is not really clear what happened with the plaster cast housed in the Academy before the fire. And so far, not even our detailed investigation could shed some light on their destiny. There is a rumor in artistic circles in Santiago that those casts during the 70s and 80s, they were kept, but a piece was destroyed in every opening of contemporary art exhibitions as like an artistic manifesto. Next door, in the National Museum, the same year, 1969, marks a change of the leadership and the profile of the institution. The new director, an architect and artist, Nemesio Antunes, decided to renovate the museum, and with this modernization, the fate of the copies was sealed. For Antunes, the reproductions in the hall equaled with museum as a mausoleum. In the press and interviews with the director, the phrases relating to the museum repeatedly included, such as the taste of the previous century, the smell of naphthalene, the symmetry of art. One journalist in 1969 described the museum as follows, I quote, "There's some 20 figures in plaster with no value, no past. The visitor to the National Museum of Fine Arts feels like leaving. Outside the Forestal Park, the museum building is set indeed in the park. The Forestal Park buzzes with life. Inside, under the glass dome, the hall with the sculptures remains silent and dead. The word museum needs cleaning from its staleness and dust." With the postulates of renovation, of opening the museum for the public and the contemporary Chilean art, as well as various culture events such as theater, music, ballet happenings, Antunes changed the focus of the museum, and as he said, it was time to say goodbye to the Venus de Milo and say goodbye to the gloomy frigidity of the previous century. The description of some of those announced diverse activities in the building today might sound rather bizarre. For example, in the beginning of the 1970s, the museum organized a concert for the plaster casts. During the activity, 5 dancers dressed up in white robes replaced some of the plaster sculptures and danced on the pedestals to the sounds of electronic music and traditional instruments of indigenous peoples of Chile. Such events obviously demonstrate clearly here the change of the attitude towards the copies and, in fact, the common lack of respect for the once venerated classical art. So, coming back to the situation in '69, the new director's aversion to the plaster cast has to be associated with the question of authenticity. Nevertheless, its focus is slightly different than in a similar discussion in Europe. While the conflict usually focuses on the opposition between the original and the copy, in which the first has more value than the latter, mainly because of its direct connection with the hand of the author, the question of authenticity in the context of the museum's reforms of the early 1970s presents similarities to the concept of aura, or in this case, rather lack of it. For Antunes, plaster casts and other copies presented no value because those images belong to a specific culture, space, and time. Only in that particular context, the works preserve their meaning, their real value and truth. For Chilean public, the copies were lifeless and out of place because they represented the ideals of past centuries' European art. Instead, Antunes proposed a museum embedded within the local context, with the emphasis on contemporary art and Chilean artistic production. The urge to present national art instead of the European copies should be understood within the context of the growing tendency of the so-called Latinoamericanismo, the search of the Latin American identity, the idea of artistic independence from Europe, the decolonization of art and restitution of local visual tradition. Indeed, the artists, the literati and intellectuals of the period were looking for the national identity in popular Chilean art. Finally, Antunes' transformation of the museum occurred just after the 1968 protests, resulting in another education reform in Chile, and reflects the ideals of socialist movement gaining strength during the decade of the 1960s, opting for the creation of new man and new society. Here, the search of new art and the establishment of the new museum would serve considerably for that purpose. The first steps of the renovation included the construction of a large modern exhibition room in the underground of the main hall. When the museum reopened in 1971, the copies, naturally, did not return to the hall. They were replaced with original, old and contemporary works of mainly national artists. By the way, those are the only photos from the period that we have, those from the cleaning process. In the years 1971-73, many reproductions followed also in the steps of the copies sent to regional museums and other institutions in the 1930s. This time, they were transferred or lent for indefinite period, for example, to artistic high schools or university campuses, where the majority still exist. Oh, I'm sorry, that's another picture from just after the opening of the new hall in the underground. Those are two marble copies of the Boxers by Canova. Today they are in the stadium of the military school in Santiago, so the relation between bodybuilding and the sculptures comes back again. That's a figure that today is housed in the library of the medicine faculty in Santiago. The remaining figures, the ones remaining in the museum, were stored in different parts of the museum, often in very poor conditions, which resulted in their destruction. Eventually, in 1977, over 70 pieces were removed from the catalogue of the museum, while their shards thrown away. The only reproductions that stayed on view were located in the public use spaces without the character of exhibition rooms, degraded into purely decorative objects. As we can see here, some pieces are on top of the shelf in the museum library. Since the 1970s, the copies disappeared not only physically from the exhibition spaces, but also historically from the consciousness of the museum authorities and researchers. The catalogue of the museum collections published in 1984 not only does not mention any of the reproductions, but also omits entirely the figure of Alberto Macena and the history of his management of the sculpture copies collection. Similarly, in the catalogue published in 2010, for the 100th anniversary of the museum, the presence of the Museo de Copias is limited to this full page of archival photos of the hall, but lacks any description or even a short mention in the collection in the introduction or any of the following studies in the catalogue. The years of negligence and oblivion affected both the collection itself as well as knowledge about its scope and history. When the current head of collections arrived to the museum in 2007, the inventories were incomplete, and precisely the collection of sculpture was the one that remained the least revised and studied. She started with an analysis of the old catalogues and soon realized that many of the works listed did not exist physically in the museum anymore. A more systematic research about the collection of Museo de Copias started only about a year ago, in 2014. Since then, we have managed to reconstruct virtually a large part of the collection, which gave us the idea of what kind of works were brought from Europe. With a thorough analysis of the museum archives, we have learned about the changing attitude towards the reproductions of the museum's past directors and its public. Also, a systematic revision of the depots and sometimes even some forgotten copy halls resulted even in the rediscovery of some pieces that were thought to have been gone. We have established a new storeroom dedicated exclusively to sculpture, and we equipped it with necessary infrastructure. We have also intended to locate all the figures sent to different institutions, as well as examine and photograph the ones that we managed to find. Moreover, we demanded the copies which have been on loan since the 1970s to be returned to the museum. This is an ongoing process, but one of our small successes was the inclusion of this head of Michelangelo's David into the permanent exhibition in the hall. Being on loan in the National Library in Santiago, probably since the early 1970s, it returned to the museum in March 2015 and was placed in the main hall immediately. That's where it is right now. Finally, next year we planned a permanent exhibition of sculpture to occupy this main hall, with the inclusion of the remaining pieces of the Museo de Copias. And moreover, we would like to organize a conference focused on the reproductions collections in the local Latin American context, and we're planning a publication of a catalogue raison of the sculpture collection of the museum. Although we have advanced considerably in the last year or so, there are still many challenges in front of our collections department and the museum's curators. These include an in-depth investigation of the archives and historical sources in Europe, especially France and Italy, as the place of origin of those copies. The collection, moreover, the collection requires a thorough study of its proper maintenance and a complex restoration of the pieces, especially the plaster cast pieces that are covered, obviously, with many layers of paint. For now, we have only started with the terracotta pieces, and some of them are in the process of restoration. Additionally, we intend to present the public with a new perspective and create a positive reception of the copies. That will be the purpose of this exhibition that we're planning. And finally, still, many a time, we still need to fight to convince the authorities of the value that the Museo de Copias has as an evidence of specific tendencies of the beginning of the 20th century in Chile, and above all, as one of the foundational collections of the museum, telling us this forgotten episode from the history of the building and the institution. Thank you very much for your time.